August 15th, 1944. 2 months after the Normandy landings, several 100,000 American, British, Canadian, and especially French soldiers land in the south of France. For the first time since the defeat in 1940, a French army is to fight on home soil.
At Anfa, the Americans and British wanted a landing that they could call French.
The Provence landing was always forgotten, but in the end it was very important. With 80% pieds noirs. That's never mentioned either.
Similarly, they totally marginalized the resistance, who were holding the fort, both during the landing and before.
I'm not that proud. I could have done more. But one loves one's homeland, always.
In June 1940, France, defeated by Germany, sees part of its territory occupied. It then enters a period of collaboration with the Hitler regime. In November 1942, after the Allied landings on French territories in North Africa, the Germans invade the Free Zone. The French Navy scuttles its ships in Toulon to prevent them falling into enemy hands. Throughout 1943, at international conferences, the Allies developed their strategy to deal Nazi Germany a decisive blow. The Free French, under the authority of General de Gaulle in London and in Africa, organized the resistance and the rebuilding of an army.
The French army wants revenge. Quite obviously, the humiliation of 1940 was indeed a humiliation, for all the French, in fact. But for General de Gaulle and for the military, it was really humiliating.
At the Casablanca conference, for us French, it was the keystone of everything that happened subsequently. The Americans had summoned the French, and in fact it was President Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill who had come in person to tell the French what they intended to do next. The British and the Americans declared that they would see it through to the end. This was the first time they overtly wanted to see Germany brought to its knees.
Despite opposition from the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who advocated a breakthrough in the Balkans, the Allies finally decide on 2 landings in France, one in the north and one in the south, to snare the German army in a pincer movement.
Churchill, who wanted the landing to be in the Balkans, and Eisenhower say, the main thing for us is Marseille, because from Marseille we can supply the troops that have landed in Normandy.
For that, they need deep-water ports, ports that can accommodate enough boats. And there aren't that many deep-water ports. There's Marseille and there's Port de Boux.
The Normandy landings were organized almost exclusively, it must be said, by the Americans. The British, of course, were involved to a point, and on the outside were the French.
In June 1944, American General Dwight Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in Europe, organized Operation Overlord in Normandy. He entrusted command of the landing in Provence, Operation Dragoon, to General Alexander Patch, head of the 7th U.S. Army.
It's up to France to carve out its own place. It is included rather late on in the drawing up of the plans and the landings, particularly the one in the Mediterranean, where it would play a significant part, as the 7th U.S. Army is made up of 2 entities, an American Army Corps and the French B Army under General de Lattre. General de Latte commands both the Free French elements, those original followers of de Gaulle who make up the 1st Free French Division, or DFL, and elements from the Army of Africa.
Participation in the landing for people coming from Africa and the overseas territories came to almost 200,000 men.
The Army of Africa is composed of men from the Army of the Armistice, who are professional soldiers, French resistance fighters who escaped from France via Spain, and then there are the Europeans of North Africa, a small minority of volunteers, but mainly conscripts. There is a wide-ranging call-up of North African Europeans, plus non-European volunteers and conscripts who are mainly, in most of the Army of Africa units, Moroccans or Algerians or Tunisians, or what we called Senegalese riflemen.
It wasn't just the Army of Africa, as I often hear it called. It was a fine French army. You should know that the vast majority of them enrolled under our flag spontaneously, volunteering to liberate our homeland.
In Algeria, we were more than patriotic. We were motivated. That's the word. We wanted to go and liberate France. That would have made us proud.
The Army of Africa emerges wreathed in glory when it intervenes in Provence, thanks to its attitude during the Italian campaign, which was still underway and in which it took part. Don't forget these units in the French Army of Africa participated in the very fierce battles of Monte Cassino and Mont Belvedere, where they won renown.
Monte Cassino, the war will bring fame to that name, yet devastate this beautiful land. The French sound the attack. With one sweep, they overrun the enemy defenses. General de Montsabert, commander of the 3rd Algerian Division.
With enormous losses, but with great support from the Moroccan troops, especially the Goumiers, who were exceptional fighting men. We Berbers signed up in the Goum, and the Goumiers were devils. We weren't scared of fighting.
What made the Goum valuable was that they were excellent shots. They had common sense, they loved weapons, and they were good observers. They were the architects of the French victory.
There was no desertion. Not one. The Goumiers were scared of nothing.
The French troops, commanded by General de Lattre de Tassigny, are armed and trained in North Africa by the Americans and the British. For the first time since the defeat in 1940, a French army will fight on home soil.
We were trained like no one else, and that helped enormously.
The Mediterranean landing is, in any case, an expected landing. It's not a surprise. We know that the Germans are preparing. Since November 1943, the population has been shifted from the coastline, with houses demolished, trees felled, and fields destroyed to make room for defensive installations. An estimated 600,000 mines have been laid along the Var coastline by the Germans. Added to this are scores of pillboxes and anti-tank walls.
The Palais des Festivals in Cannes is a former German bunker, so they did dig up a fair bit. And we had Michelin maps showing all the pillboxes. I must say, we didn't think we'd ever get to land.
Throughout Provence, the resistance is getting organized. In preparation for the landing, it steps up its attacks and its intelligence and sabotage actions.
These actions consist in cutting off communications links, railway lines, secondary lines, and bridges. They were the main targets in order to avoid German reprisals. Weapons drops are stepped up, though they were still insufficient. And then come the parachute missions. Soldiers dropped by the Algiers headquarters in particular. In fact, the Germans overestimate the resistance forces. They think that there are several thousand men gathered at Cajuers, reinforced by Allied paratroopers, which is absurd.
Taking off from Corsica, liberated in autumn 1943, and Italy, Allied pilots carry out reconnaissance missions above the Rhone Valley and along the Mediterranean coast.
These planes, which flew very slowly, were carrying cameras and photographic equipment. Though they flew very, very slowly, they made round trips from Perpignan to Ventimiglia along the shore. Saint-Exupéry had one of these planes, and my cousin Adrian had another. And they'd take photos all day long at a certain altitude, obviously to find out whether there were mines in the sea along the shoreline.
The landing was meticulously prepared.
In the weeks preceding the landings, Allied planes bombed the German defences from Nice to Marseille. These bombardments claim a good many victims among the population.
On May 27th, for instance, they bombed the railway stations, Saint-Charles, La Blancarde, so the whole city is affected. Thousands of buildings are demolished, but there are also hundreds of deaths.
So everyone went down to the cellar, but in the cellar everyone was crying and wailing. My father said there's no point going to the cellar because if a bomb falls, it'll bomb the cellar anyway. So you've had it down there and up here. You might as well stay home if you're not scared. It's true, in fact, he was right, because it was quieter at home. Even if we were scared, that was how it was. The bombs kept on coming.
We're amazed to see that this population, who suffer from the Allied bombing, don't turn against the Allies. They see the real culprits as the occupiers and their French auxiliaries. So the hope of liberation is there. The expectation of liberation is there.
Early August in the Mediterranean ports, Allied troops prepared to embark. The fleet will soon move to the south of France.
We embarked the morning of the 14th. We joined the Armada off the coast with hundreds and hundreds of boats as far as the eye can see, in every direction. You wonder how the boats didn't bang into each other. It's incredible. There were hundreds of planes to protect the fleet. There was fighting, and the Germans tried, but they didn't succeed. Not one boat was sunk.
With the landings in Normandy, a certain number of units, in particular panzer units, were transferred to the Normandy front, as were artillery units. So the strength of these German units is fairly relative. There is no reserve. The artillery is very weak. The Navy is very weak. There's no air cover. So these are weakened forces occupying Provence. The port of Toulon is an entrenched camp, heavily defended by batteries, particularly the 340mm battery at Cap Cepé. And that's the reason why the Mediterranean landings will take place on the Côte d'Or. That is, in a sector far enough away from the Toulon guns.
In the night of August the 14th, 3 commando forces are sent into action to clear the path. The French African commandos at Cap Negre, the French Navy at Le Traias, American and Canadian Rangers on the Ile d'Hyères.
In the evening of the 14th, around 10 p.m., we received the order to board the landing craft, the LCAs. So I get into a boat with my mortar section. There's about 40 of us in those boats. We land on an unknown beach. The colonel is hurrying us along. There are 600 men on this tiny little beach. The landings are going very well. Our mission was to land to the west of the Cavalier landing, and the naval assault group landed to the east of Le Traias. They didn't have the luck that we had, though. They were virtually all eliminated. And while we were all landing, Captain Bigorneau was taking Cap Negre. I know it was pretty difficult because it did come down to hand-to-hand fighting, and 30 men against 150 is pretty tough. But the 3 big guns were destroyed. Guns with a long range that prevented ships from coming within 30 or 40 kilometers, which hindered the landing.
In the early morning, a 4th Airborne Commando unit is dropped inland close to Draguignan. This force, which set off from Italy, commanded by General Frédéric, is composed of paratroopers and gliders. Around 5 a.m., close to 10,000 American and British paratroopers jump above Le Mouille Plain.
Operation Frédéric was pretty much the icing on the cake, because they wanted to cut off the troops in the north around Draguignan, and there were Germans there. Dropping 9,000 guys out of the sky in the night was quite something. General Frédéric was an absolutely extraordinary guy. I saw him. He put together this operation, and he had some nerve.
But when we were marching to the aircraft, somebody started singing the Marseillaise. And that was a moment I shall never forget. Everybody in the whole camp started singing. That was really very emotional.
We left Italy in the middle of the night, and when we landed here, it was like 4:30 in the morning. It was still dark. Then an hour later, it got light. Now, I was lucky. I landed in Le Mouille. Had a good landing.
The planes had problems because it was foggy, and they were about 23 miles away from where we were supposed to be. But they dropped us, and we landed in the mountains just outside of Le Mouille. And then we were spread all over.
The parachute drop goes badly. Young, inexperienced pilots spread Frédéric's men over tens of kilometers around Le Mouille.
I was 19 years old. This is the drop zone where I jumped in August 15th. It was late in the evening, I think it was about 6 o'clock. I actually landed, these grapes were not here. This was all open field. The greenhouses down there were not there at that time. Our first objective was to clear the area of the enemy so the gliders could come in.
The American losses are relatively small. They are estimated at around 1,000 men, some of whom are victims of glider accidents or parachute accidents. Most are buried in the Rhone American Cemetery in Draguignan.
There are 862 graves. That's all the dead from Operation Frédéric.
My best friend, Robert Brown, is in the cemetery. And we plan on seeing that grave again.
As paratroopers spread out toward their objectives, they establish contact with French forces of the interior, whose support has figured extensively in the Battle of France.
And the commando's mission was to establish a bridgehead and hold that bridgehead until the arrival of the Americans, who were due to land at 8 a.m. in the morning of the 15th, and then join us.
August 15th, 8 a.m. is go time. 3 American divisions, supported by a French unit, form the first wave. The German soldiers are swamped by the speed and scope of the attack.
It was the Americans who were out in force. The day of the landing, there was only one tank squadron, the 4th Squadron. The others landed the following day.
The forces landed in the first 2 days by the Americans total 115,000 men, and obviously several hundred vehicles.
In the evening of August the 15th, the American soldiers have only lost a few dozen dead and wounded around Fréjus and Saint-Raphael.
Fréjus resists a bit, but falls on the 16th. Troops there link up with the troops at Le Mouilly in the evening of the 15th. The junction is established on the 16th. On the evening of the 15th, the Americans are at Colobrières, where the Valier Maquis has come down from the 15 Juillet to be in the forefront when the landing happens. So this bridgehead quickly goes far beyond what was hoped.
On August 16th, General de Latre's army lands. While the American troops must head for the Rhone Valley, the French soldiers' mission is to liberate the ports of Marseille and Toulon. De Latre manages to convince the Americans that his own troops should be swiftly engaged in the fighting.
So he plays his part. It's a role written for him by de Gaulle, to make the voice of France heard alongside the Americans. It wasn't easy, as, despite everything, the French forces were equipped by the Americans and were essentially subordinate to the Americans. In addition, de Latre is a general with stage savvy. He knows whom and how to flatter. He's rather like a diva with acute political awareness.
I think de Latre was the ideal man for the job. He was very lordly. I saw him later in Indochina. He wasn't a guy you'd have a joke with.
Superbe.
Magnificent.
Toujours habillé.
Always well dressed.
Il était très, très sévère.
He was very strict about his men's appearance.
La tenue. Ça a été
He was a great military leader.
Chef militaire, très grand.
He deserved to be marshal.
In the end, there are some very different characters in command of this French army. On the one hand, there's the rather aristocratic de Lattre, who favors the ceremonial, conducting staff meetings with his cane. And then Montsabert, who is more hands-on, very aware of any opportunities which may arise.
I was close to Montsabert during the Tunisia campaign. He was a brave chap, rather like an exceptional second lieutenant. He was funny. Very familiar with his fine mustache, very straightforward. He wanted me to call him by his first name, but I was respectful back then. But he was a great leader of men in the field.
Following in the commando's footsteps, the main body of troops progresses in a setting of classical gentleness affected by the harsh scars of war. The breach is open. Along with the Free French, hope enters occupied France.
And on August 19th, the general order to withdraw is given. Consequently, the German forces move north, except for Toulon and Marseille. There, the order is to hold fast at whatever cost.
Marching towards Hyères, the French African commandos reduce the Mauvin guns to silence. A few kilometers further on, the 1st Free French Division captures the Gulf Hotel, killing close to 200 German soldiers.
It appears that there are more than 10,000 men in the entrenched camp that is Toulon. The figures vary wildly. So there may be around 18,000 men from a variety of mixed units in Toulon, all fighting fiercely. Toulon is without doubt the main battle of the Provence campaign.
3 French divisions hurry towards Toulon, including the 9th Colonial Infantry Division, which clashes with the German defense at Les Trois Soliès.
In the 9th DIC, there's an officer who will go on to generate a certain amount of controversy, called Salon. And Colonel Salon will fight the Battle of Les Soliès, and in particular Soliès-Ville at the head of the Senegalese riflemen.
Soliès-Ville was dreadful. It ended up in knife fights. That's how the Moroccan commandos managed to take Soliès-Ville. It ended in the square with knives drawn.
Another major difficulty awaits the French soldiers. The fort on Mount Coudon, overlooking Toulon, occupied by more than 150 German soldiers.
For Coudron, we had no plan of attack. We knew it was a very important fort. From up there, it controlled all the defenses. No boats could approach, and neither could a land force. There was a huge German gun battery up there, and they lost quite a few men, including a lieutenant I'd met, who was an amazing guy, Ducournau. He was killed there. They broke through the roof of the stronghold and threw tons of grenades into it, which meant the Germans lost a lot of men, and they surrendered. That didn't happen all on its own. They really were overtrained soldiers, rather like us.
With this advance of the light tanks of the 9th DIC to La Valette, they find themselves stuck in La Valette because the infantry is still at La Farlade and the logistics haven't kept pace. In fact, one of the problems the Americans and the French encounter is just that. The advance is so rapid that logistics can't always keep up.
The taking of La Valette was really something. The guys were in La Valette, stuck in their tanks, surrounded by the Germans who were all over the place shooting at them. They were thinking, it's over. There's no point anymore. We'll never get out. We had a perfect view from the fort. With our mortars, we fired on the batteries and the guns. We destroyed all those guns, allowing the 9th DIC to enter La Valette.
9th Colonial Infantry Division, or DIC, was a division stationed in Toulon before the war. And that's why Delattre gave it the honor, if you will, of liberating the heart of the city. There was, of course, Colonel Bonjour laying siege to the entrenched camp of Toulon, the liberation of Bandol, and basically the siege of Toulon, which happened August 21st and 22nd, when the entrenched camp is totally surrounded. The 6th Fort is bombarding the Allied troops as they advance upon Toulon, and obviously target for a siege. And then there is the Saint-Mandrier Peninsula, where Admiral Rufus, the commander of the German camp, the entrenched camp, is hemmed in and ends up surrendering, as we know, on the night of August 27th. He laid down arms on the morning of the 28th.
Of the 5,000 who remained locked in almost until the end, a good half of them were Waffen-SS, and they were killers. Make no mistake. They couldn't do much because they were confined there. They admitted that Mr. Rufus was the boss, as he surrendered for the lot of them. He surrendered his sword. He was very solemn, Rufus. It really was high operetta when he surrendered.
Toulon is in ruins. The port and the arsenal in particular. 2,700 Frenchmen were killed or wounded during the assault. The Germans suffer several thousand losses, and more than 17,000 are taken prisoner.
So they drew up a battle plan for Marseille. And Delattre says, my battle plan is that you skirt around Geminos, you'll come up against the mines around Gardanne, go right to the end, and when you get there, Marseille will be surrounded and we'll enter Marseille. De Montseber, who was friends with Delattre, says, no, I wouldn't do that, General. I'd take advantage of the fact that the Germans are shaken by Toulon to enter Marseille directly. So Delattre replies, look, if you succeed, I won't say a thing. But if you fail, never speak to me again.
I'd felt there was a real split between the defense of Toulon and the defense of Marseille. So much so that I carried on my route in this spirit until we learned that the gateway of Aubagne was firmly held by the enemy. I decided to attack Aubagne. The attack was first of all triggered by our armoured elements, soon supported by the arrival of the Goumiers, who, as they landed, were gradually deployed around Aubagne with the mission to blow the Aubagne bottleneck.
If we hadn't been there, no one would have chased off the Germans. They would have attacked the Foreign Legion, they would have attacked the Senegalese, but as soon as they heard the word Goum, they ran away.
Aubagne. We landed and drove out the Germans. We set off again, them in front and us behind. We went all the way to the port of Marseille like that. The battle was fierce. There was fire in the heaven and on earth. Many were killed, men were falling like flies.
As for Marseille, it was the native troops who skirted round the city in the hills and then came down into the northern suburbs. That takes veteran troops who are used to doing that and who are really battle-hardened. They suffered major casualties. The German forces in Marseille and in the region were very numerous, as there were several divisions, between 15 and 20,000 men left in Marseille on Hitler's orders to prevent the city being invaded.
Toulon isn't yet liberated when Montsabert's troops head towards Marseille, where since August 19th the FFI, the French forces of the interior, who rallied the various resistance movements, launched an urban guerrilla campaign against the German forces.
For the sons of France, wherever they are, their simple yet sacred duty is to fight by any means at their disposal. The goal is to destroy the enemy.
One of the features of the liberation of the cities of our region is that they are among the few cities in France where the insurgency, the so-called national uprising, took place. There weren't many in France. Paris, of course, but there was Marseille, Toulon, and to some extent, Draguignan. Draguignan, seat of the Var prefecture, was liberated by the resistance before the arrival of the U.S. airborne troops. This was unexpected. As for Marseille, the CGT trade union called for an insurrection on August 19th, and in particular on Monday, August 21st, the CDL, the Departmental Liberation Committee, recommended a march on the Préfecture. This resulted in the resistance movements and the armed forces of the resistance marching on the Préfecture on August 21st and seizing control.
What mattered to us was managing to convince the people of Marseille and all the locals that they had to rise up against the German occupation. We marched up the Canebière till we reached the prefecture. There were thousands of people. Everyone who was available was out on the street.
General Schaefer wrote that a general uprising was to be feared. It was predictable. It was evident that things would happen in that way. And it was clear that there were French forces in the city and that they were supported by the population. But for the French population, it wouldn't have all happened so quickly.
The problem was that they didn't have many weapons. So how did they go about arming themselves? By attacking the Germans, by disarming them, and by disarming the police forces.
So we pinched and stole from the Germans, shall we say, their work tools, because at the time weapons were useful to them. It was a revolver, a real one. It was about this long, a revolver. I made off with it. But I was on a bike, so someone might have run after me, but they never would have caught me. I was just 20.
There were lots of young people in Marseille who picked up guns and killed Germans. But there were so many who got killed themselves, poor things. What can a boy do with a hunting rifle when on the corner there are 2 or 3 Germans with sophisticated weapons? The poor guy would be shot every time. So in Marseille, you have lots of plaques at street corners where men from Marseille were killed.
On the 22nd, I received the brave resistance fighters from Marseille, very excited by the battles they were waging within the city. Under these conditions, my mission was simple. My duty was to help the defenders, or more exactly, the Marseille resistance, get as far into the city as necessary to continue to support their glorious fight within the city.
The city isn't liberated, but the resistance is holding out. The heart of the city, in particular the FTP, the foreigners in the FTP MOI, the patriotic militia, the Groupe Franc of the resistance, are all present in the city and take up arms. to the surprise, in fact, of the arriving soldiers, notably Colonel Chapuis and the Algerian riflemen, who didn't expect such easy penetration into a partly liberated city.
The enemy is packing its bags. It still holds Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde, the Château d'If, the Ile du Frioul, the Saint-Jean and Saint-Nicolas forts, whence it can hold the Canebière.
From a military point of view, it seems less harsh than Toulon, though the people of Marseille won't thank me for that. What is evident from a geostrategic point of view is that the port of Marseille is far more important than the port of Toulon, of course. It's a difficult battle. The Moroccan troops in particular suffer considerable losses when attacking positions in which the Germans are firmly entrenched. But it was a battle from one resistance pocket to another. Borelli Park, Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde. In Le Racati are kernels of resistance that are extremely complicated to conquer, of course.
With hostilities suspended, the enemy asks for a parley. The streets are immediately thronged with joyful locals welcoming the liberators, who are wildly acclaimed.
A first ceasefire is called. It allows General de Montsabert to begin talks with the German General Schaefer, but he refused to surrender. I could tell that in terms of morale, the Germans were deeply affected and that we must take advantage of this situation to speed things up. So I left General Schaefer. I decided to attack Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde so as to dominate the whole of Marseille. The difficulty, as everyone knows, is that Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde is atop a very high hill, which overlooks everything. Consequently, you had to trouble the adversary by the number of attacks coming up the hill from every direction.
The taking of Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde was done by Algerian riflemen, who climbed up via a small passage on the flank of Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde, and in this way managed to reach the summit and take the German troops from the rear.
From then on, to sum up the situation, it really was total confusion. We no longer had an overall view. It was pointless asking our superiors what we should do. Our duty was to be there, to defend until the last cartridge, as Schaefer notes in his report. It was obvious that that wasn't possible.
And the Germans surrendered. There were a good many at Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde, more than 1,000. They weren't very enthusiastic. They knew the game was up. They're also scared of surrendering to the resistance because they see them as terrorists who would summarily execute them. So that plays into the hands of the regular troops. They would rather surrender to the regular French troops than the resistance fighters.
The last German bastions are soon reduced to silence. The conquest of Marseille had claimed the lives of around 1,500 French soldiers, more than 5,500 Germans, and several hundred from among the local population and the resistance. More than 10,000 German prisoners are herded into camps in Marseille, like the one at Sainte-Marthe.
The surrender of Marseille happens on the 28th. Weapons are laid down in both cities at the same time. They thought Toulon would fall 20 days after the landings. In fact, Toulon fell 7 days previously. Marseille fell at the same time as Toulon when it was expected to take 40 days. The deadlines were shattered.
And this great start to the future begins with an apotheosis. In the presence of their victorious leaders, accompanied by Minister of War Mr. Ditalme, our armed forces, as part of a grandiose demonstration, round off the liberation by liberating hearts. The patriotism repressed during the dark years of oppression bursts into long ovation. The whole of Marseille acclaims the head of the First Army, General Delart de Tassigny, who liberated the city 30 days before the expected date, and General de Montsabert, whose clever and rapid maneuver avoided material damage and who was named a free man of the city.
For Marseille, Montsabert has remained the absolute symbol of the liberation of Marseille. If you go to Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde, you'll see all the commemorative plaques to Montsabert, or which mention Montsabert and the liberation troops. In fact, one of the first of Montsabert's initiatives is to hold a mass in Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde. He was very Catholic, very religious.
Against an incomparable backdrop, a contemplative crowd witnesses the Te Deum. The divine office takes place in the presence of Generals de Montsabert, Guillaume, and Besançon.
As for de Montsabert, you know there are big plaques at Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde bearing the legend, "No, we didn't save Marseille, she did."
The liberation of Marseille means we have a deep-water port that will allow the Allies to land troops and equipment, and which will enable the liberation troops to quickly move up the Rhône Valley and link up with the troops in Normandy. Clearly, the campaign of the Rhône Valley went a good way to redeeming France's contribution. Everybody, especially the Germans, are convinced of that.
The link-up between the Normandy army and that of Provence happens on September the 12th, 1944, just north of Dijon. In accordance with the original objectives, Overlord joined Dragoon, trapping the German army in a pincer.
This junction of troops landed in Normandy and troops landed in Marseille plays an absolutely key role. The German troops are caught in a vice, firstly cutting France in two, and therefore cutting off those troops in the southwest, many of whom withdraw. And this opens up the way towards Germany.
The port of Toulon resumes its operation in mid-September. Firstly, there are a great many mines that were laid. There are the wrecks from the scuttling, some of which are still here because the Germans used them to block the channels. The Resistance Navy, the Free French Naval Force, makes its entry on September 13th, 2 days before General de Gaulle's arrival in Toulon.
On September 13th, when we sailed in with the whole fleet, we arrived at noon. It was raining, and it was sad, terribly sad. You don't emerge from a disastrous period like that with a flower in your cap singing, "Hurrah, we killed them all." Of course, people were happy, but that's about all it was.
It was harder to rehabilitate the port of Marseille, but they used Port de Boue a lot. But finally, the repairs are carried out in the weeks following the liberation, and which enable it to supply huge U.S. bases. Delta Base section is installed at Plan de Campagne, where there is now a shopping mall. Delta Base is one of the large U.S. support commands for American forces in Europe. So the Mediterranean landings play an undisputed part in the liberation of France, as well as the liberation of Europe, if only because it opens a supply link to the U.S. armies, which is far from negligible.
For the French people, it was a different point of view. World politics is one thing, but this was our home. It was happening at our door, and for us, this provided a new surge of passion. And in hindsight, I think that this was what really established General de Gaulle.
It was one of the assets that de Gaulle will use brilliantly to ensure that the country defeated in 1940 finds itself seated at the victors' table on May 8th, 1945. If any victory is down to de Gaulle, it's this one, because it certainly wasn't in the cards.
And it was Delattre who, on behalf of France, ratifies the German surrender on May the 8th, 1945 in Berlin. Through this epic story, often undervalued or overlooked in the national memory, we pay tribute to all of those who fought in Provence in August 1944 for the liberation of Europe and for our freedom.
But we're in Provence. Is the sleepy land of the cicada really a fitting backdrop for such spectacular operations?